What is up, everybody? Welcome back. It's part 2 of the Run Your Mouth podcast with the resident historian, Gary Richide. Mr. Gary, how are you, my friend?
Doing great, Robbie. You've been doing a little reading. Of course, anti-Semitic reading because it's it's all from Buchanan. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I haven't even been reading. I've been listening to the audiobook and then realizing I absorbed about 10%. And I do have some non-politics stuff that I want to talk about, but before
Yeah.
we do, let's give some people some juicy juice right off the top with you in text claiming to me that Churchill was in fact a pedophile. So what do you got on that?
Well, there's a historian, John Hamer, who is very good at unearthing a lot of these controversial issues, diving into supposedly heroic figures who deserve, supposedly, according to the establishment narrative of history, our total respect, awe, admiration, and worship. And he has noted and looked at a variety of sources. I mean, Churchill was unmarried. He was never said to have any serious relationship with women. In fact, some
Wait,
of
does that
his
make you a pedophile? Because I haven't done either of those things either.
I guess yeah,
If
that's like half the audience
that's
now.
the core evidence that you're coming up with, I gotta take the other side on this one.
Exactly. What would Nick Fuentes say about this?
Yeah.
So anyway, yeah, and then furthermore, there's a lot of there's sort of innuendos, insinuations that he was off and flying, for example, young boys around on planes. He was taking a lot of private trips, and these are logged in British archives. And he was going to places that were notorious pedophilia centers, like North Africa, a lot. And it's just so happens that
Taking a boys' trip.
centers. Sorry, say that again.
I said taking a boys' trip.
Yeah, different meaning here. These happen to correspond with, for you and I, one of the great villains of history, and that's John Maynard Keynes. We are absolutely certain that he was a pedophile.
What's the proof on him being a pedophile?
Oh, I mean, letters that he wrote. I mean, this is actually, you read Bitcoin Standard, right?
Yes, I don't remember that Keynes was a pedophile.
Okay, get this. All right, so Safedine, who's amazing on so many levels, I can read directly from this. He said, a son of a rich family that had accumulated significant capital over generations, Keynes was a libertine hedonist who wasted most of his adult life engaging in sexual relationships with children, including traveling around the Mediterranean to visit children's brothels. So he goes on to say that this was kind of a weird but accepted practice in these boarding schools, these elite boarding schools like in Eton, where this rampant homosexuality went on. And then just to verify, there's a book which chronicles, it was actually written by a historian, this Holroyd guy, and it was focusing on Leighton Stanchey, who was Keynes's one of his early lovers. And in it, Stanchey says that he and Keynes corresponded frequently, in quote, when he would visit Tunis, where, in quote, bed and boy were not expensive. And then in another biography of Keynes himself called Keynes: A Critical Life, this historian David Felix unearthed a letter that was from Keynes's pen itself. He said, I'm leaving for Egypt, ellipses. I just learned that bed and boy, in quote, is prepared. In another letter, he recommended to Stanchey to go to Tunis and Sicily if you want to go where naked boys dance. So this was...
All right, so we've got Keynes pretty... I mean, unless he had an odd sense of humor, was writing some weird letters, sounds like a pedophile. Do we have any more substantial evidence that Churchill's a pedophile?
Well, other than just his no. And that's pretty much where it goes out. I would have to look at other historians other than Hamer and these other guys who are critical of Churchill to take a look at that. But it seems to me that he was running in these circles. He was also in these elite boarding schools like Eton. And at the very least, his sexuality is very odd. He's kind of a non-incel globetrotter of sorts. And again, he's frequently places. Oh, by the way, I was mentioning before that we have records of his travels during this period of time, both in the interbellum period, so the time between the wars, and then even during the war, where it's like in normal archives, it would say Churchill flew from London to Tunis, or from London or Dublin to Casablanca or to Newfoundland for the Atlantic Conference. And they would state like what he was doing there. But all of a sudden, all of these things are redacted when he arrives in these kind
Okay,
of
so do you think it was
places.
happenstance that Keynes, who, I mean, to me, the relationship that Keynes has with the elites is he just came up with a economic theory by which they could go into debt and print money. And so there's a relationship
Yes.
there of, hey, it's literally the Rick and Morty episode when the idiot one is going, Pluto is a planet. And so they bring him over to Pluto as a scientist because they finally found an academic who will say that Pluto's a planet. So
Right.
to me, Keynes, he's just some idiot, or maybe not even an idiot, but he's the pretend scholar for the entire financial system of governments can take
Yes.
on debt and print money. And then the
And
humor
fund
of
the
it,
wars.
yes. And the humor of it is that his entire idea was smoothing out the business cycle that we'll spend when like when things are going well, we'll save it, and when things are going bad, we can spend it. And of course, we never save, so it's not even like we're actually following him.
Correct. It's just the same justification for the Federal Reserve in the first place, where we were sold that the boom and bust cycles and the panics of the previous century, in the 19th century, were going to be smoothed out so long as we could use a central banking mechanism to adjust the monetary supply.
Okay,
Which
so
is
but here's what I gotta ask. Let's not
Mhm.
talk about monetary policy. Let's shelve
Okay.
that for a minute and get into the boy fucking. So is it just coincidence that both Keynes and Churchill supposedly, allegedly like boys? Or are these like the more, crazy thing that you read on Twitter that the elites seem to be satanic or something else that they like? I don't know. Do these people end up in that club and then someone goes, "Oh, look, you're in the same club as me. Let me make you the head of parliament,"
Uh,
or are these people somehow getting power by sacrificing kids? I'll sacrifice a kid. If you're telling me that that's what makes you rich in this world is a sacrifice to Baal, and you just gotta, I'm kidding, of course, but
right.
I'm asking you, is this just a coincidence, or is this like the religion of the elites?
Well, first thing, I really appreciate all the assignments you give me that are sure to land me in prison, like check out, hey, Rich Eye, go check out pedophile rings and the history of it. Okay, yeah. And no red flags, we're going up there. But I had to do as much research that would not land me behind bars as possible. So it seems to be a combination of those things. Were there secretive Freemason-like pedophile cult rings that existed? Almost assuredly. And it was a kind of wink, wink, nod, nod. I mean, there was remember, I don't know if you've heard the story of this prime minister. I think his name is Ned Heath in Great Britain. I mean, this guy was the prime minister of Britain in I want to say the late 60s. And he was a known pedophile. He would actually take orphan boys out on his yacht. He would rape them and then he'd kill them and just toss them overboard. This is substantial truth that no one seems to want to talk about. How did he know of the availability of orphans in Greater London or Greater England? And who, by the way, the same maniacal things, that Robert Kennedy Jr. Chronicles with Fauci, how Fauci took those orphan kids, those orphan boys, and then knew that they had no one to protect or guard them as parents or guardians, and then injected them with all of the toxic drugs during the AIDS epidemic and crisis. He was just poisoning these kids to death. So, and he chronicles how how the older boys would tell the younger boys, don't fight the injections, because if you fought it, he would just drug induce them into a sleep and they'd wake up with a tube that was injected through their abdomen into their stomach. So these are the type of maniacal pedophilia demoniacs that we're dealing with here. Now, yeah, again, in terms of like organized pedophilia rings, I mean, yeah, these things go back to ancient times. It just so happened that when you asked me to check out the subject matter and the effect of these things on major political and social and even literary figures for that matter, it was, I'm Catholic, so I went to mass yesterday and there was a reading from St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians in which it's extremely interesting. He talks about how this nascent Christian community in ancient Corinth has to get away from all these pagan practices. And I thought I'd read a part to you that you'll find interesting. I know this is a deep dive into pederasty cults, but he says, and this is the 6th chapter, he says, why not rather let yourselves be cheated? Instead, you inflict injustice. So he's talking about, like, why are you going to pagan courts wherein you should be consulting with one another as Christians? Very similar. It's a very, and you can confirm this probably, is like a very Judaic issue. Like, why are you taking moral issues outside the community? It'd be like a Jew who's accused by the Sanhedrin going to the Roman court. And this is what they're doing in Corinth among the Christians. And he says, do you not know that the unjust will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor boy prostitutes, nor sodomites, nor thieves, nor the greedy, nor the drunkards, nor slanderers, nor robbers will inherit the kingdom of God. Now, that is actually the best English translation of boy prostitutes. In other translations, it's like the effeminate, and that's not it. It comes from the Greek word malakoi, which literally means a calamite, and a calamite is usually a boy, the subversive partner in a homosexual relationship, the catcher, the receiver. Okay, so even in this time, we can not just speculate, but affirm through this written ancient source that there are these ancient cults of pedophilia operative, especially within pagan. And it did those cults of pedophilia, whether to honeypot people or just to engage in these licentious practices. Did they continue? They most certainly did.
Well, did they within these pagan religions? Did they think that was like an offering to their god, like the same way that I guess the Aztecs or whatever in South America? I think they would do like human sacrifices. And I think that what was it
the Canaanites did it
that they referenced in the Bible a lot. So is this like seemingly a part of the religion, or just people that liked having sex with kids and so they tried to disguise it as religion?
It's a little bit of both, although again, the ancient pagan, we know, for example, the Greco-Roman treatment. Right. One scholar that I've read said in sexual matters, it wasn't so much who you were having sex with, but how you were having sex with it. So it was like, if you were the receiver, you're the effeminate one. And if you're the giver, you're the dominant one. And so it didn't really matter whether it was young, old, male, female, or as some scholars are unearthing now, is like some of these ancient cults. This is the earliest reference to, and we have today a continuation to elite gender modification. So were these girls acting like boys or boys acting like girls? Most likely the latter. So, and this idea of gender inversion is going on way back in the ancient world.
Right, so,
now about the pagan phase, like the Canaanites, we know sacrificed to Baal and on Moloch children. But on top of that, like the Phoenicians who are in the area, the Hannibal people, they were the ones who fought the Romans in the Punic Wars. They sacrificed their firstborn sons.
All right, I'm thoroughly disgusted. So let's move on.
Yeah. So I mean, why did you get all of a sudden interested in this?
I'm not going to answer that. No, because I was listening to what's his name, who was I'm sorry, the guy who was just on Tucker Carlson and
Martyr Maid.
Yeah, I was listening to Martyr Maid, and I was listening to his whole. Then I listened to his whole Epstein's theory. Which it was 4 hours long, and I listened to it on a plane ride. It was worth listening to, and then the final conclusion was kind of. It seems like this guy was Mossad. It was basically a rundown of all the I'm going to call it conspiracies that we've heard of. Where did what was his relationship with Wexner, and where was all this money coming from, and what was he doing? Why was he hanging out with these people? And it's the problem with listening to things when you're drunk and high in an airplane is you're like, man, I'm downloading all this information, and then you're on a and then you're on a podcast and you're like, yeah, I don't know what I listened to. Yeah. So anyways, it just had me thinking how prevalent is the pedophilia amongst the elites, and is there some sort of like religious demon component to the lifestyle that they're living. That's kind of what I was curious about. But let's move on. Churchill. So
Yeah.
I listened to Pat Buchanan's book, and once again, I absorbed a fair amount, but you only get so much when you're sitting in the car listening to things, or at least me. I space out a whole bunch. And I know that Dave just did an episode with Martyr Maid, which I think is going to be out soon. I haven't listened to the entire Tucker Carlson, but what I was hearing from it sounded pretty similar to Pat Buchanan's book. To give the short, it sounded like it sounded like I guess England didn't need to have a full scale war with Germany, and that he did some horrible things in that war, such as bombing of Dresden or otherwise.
Mhm.
But I'm curious. You're the historian here, so why don't you give us your take on Churchill and if he was the villain of World War II, if he's second to Hitler, Mao, and Stalin, or just how he kind of fits in the circle of evil elites.
Yeah. Daryl Cooper's soft on this one, I think.
Ooh, there you go. There you go.
He's
Juicy.
the there are two ultimate villains in the war, and this actually harkens back to, I use the word harken. That's antiquated.
Okay.
But when we did one of our earlier shows, maybe a few months ago, we went over Stalin's war. The great villain of World War II, I would argue, is Stalin.
Okay.
As
And he's really the mastermind that reshaped the globe.
Yeah, exactly. Sean McMeekin at Bard College wrote that huge book that we went over and I read for everybody here, and it's just, he makes just this overwhelming point. And by the way, McMeekin speaks Russian, he speaks Turkic, so he's gone down into the archives in the Russian in Moscow and St. Petersburg and unearthed all this stuff. And it's obvious that, of course, the main beneficiary, this, even by the way, Churchill said this himself, this is not up for debate. After the war in 1946, he gives his famous Sinews of Peace speech in Fulton, Missouri. He was invited by Truman. Sorry. And he admits in the middle of this famous speech, people know it by the Iron Curtain speech. He admits that we basically lost the war. And then for no particular reason, it seems, we let another totalitarian regime come to dominate Eastern Europe based on both Churchill's and Roosevelt's hunch or on a whim that Stalin's guarantees that he would allow for democratic and capitalistic and Western institutions and regimes to come up in Eastern Europe, that he would fulfill that promise. That's insane. Why would you believe, knowing what they knew about what Stalin did at the Katyn massacre and all these horrific things? And by the way, he just built the United States. The only reason the Soviet Union was able to stay relatively within that war was because we were funding the whole enterprise. I mean, okay, so we got off on Stalin, but back to Churchill because I want to stay on topic. Churchill is neck and neck with Stalin. And as Buchanan, I think, convincingly really argues in that book, The Unnecessary War, it's something that I argue and McMeekin argues clearly too, is that, and obviously Daryl Cooper is making a good claim to this, there are all these outs. I mean, people don't realize that, first of all, does anyone ask, why did the war begin with Poland? I mean, didn't you, I don't know, when you were like reading as a kid, like, oh, World War II happened. And then it happened, we know the date in our minds. It's September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. And then the narrative goes in the official sort of storyline, that's when all the great powers of the liberal democracies forged this strong alliance. Okay, and maybe it's not the Soviet Union yet, but we're going to bring them in as a kind of necessary evil ally. Okay, but we're going to fight this war of heroic supremacy of democracy against totalitarianism. But no one ever says, well, why Poland? I mean, why was that the tripwire? Why was that the red line? And then furthermore, remember, even after September of 1939, for the better part of a year, we're talking about 9 or 10 months, there's this thing called the phony war, in which, as Daryl Cooper pointed out, Hitler's actively corresponding with the British going, I don't want war with you. I don't even want to fight France. The reason that he invaded Poland and the rest of Eastern Europe was because he wanted these resources in order to create, as he stated over and over again, a type of economic and spatial Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people that he felt they had been screwed by Versailles and they had been taken over by, yes, the scapegoat things, but also the Allies through their financial systems,
Now,
employees, and the like.
I do remember in Pat Buchanan's book, I guess, you know, England somewhat allowed Germany. All right, let's just say World War One was a mistake, and then the end of World War One with the harsh sanctions on Germany and the fact that they didn't allow them to have their dignity, that was a mistake as well, and that
Mhm.
obviously they weren't going to be able to make the payments for the entire war, and that that wasn't going to work out. Let's just go with all of that. It sounds like though it was an even like they also made a mistake though when they tried to, I guess, walk that back and allow Germany to start building a military, and that they trusted Hitler that the rebuilding of a military was not going to be for aggressive purposes, which I guess he then does go turn around. Was Poland the first invasion, or what was the first thing he did? Was it
No, he
Poland?
invaded. For example, he annexed Austria
Right.
by some force, but he was kind of a welcome. The Nazi army was welcomed into Austria, and then he gets through the Munich conference in 1938. He gets Chamberlain to wave the white paper, and he's able to gain the Sudetenland, which is this German occupied area of Czechoslovakia. But you gotta go back to World War. You said World War One. It wasn't just the punitive actions in terms of economics and finance and pride, or national pride, that were injured at Versailles, but it was more so that literally there's an episode in which Wilson's at Versailles, and they're drawing this map of what's going to be Europe, and it's of course so punitive to Germany. And someone goes at the end of the conference and goes, Mr. Wilson, you're putting 3 million Germans into Czechoslovakia. And basically he does this thing like the King and I, or Pontius Pilate, and says, well, what I have drawn, I have drawn. We are setting things up for the breakup of these arbitrarily drawn states. By the way, Czechs and Slovaks don't get along, but he just mushes them together. The Croats and Serbs, they don't get along. So he mushes them together in Yugoslavia. It just means Southern Slavia. And look at the ramifications of that. By the way, on top of that, it wasn't just Wilson, but Churchill too, through David Lloyd George at Versailles, who were big advocates of these like national conglomerates. I mean, Churchill creates Iraq. He was like the founder of Iraq, where there's Kurds here from the old Ottoman Empire. Let's smush them together with a bunch of Sunni and Shiite Muslims and see what happens. Well, of course, then we're dealing with the ramifications of that later.
So when Pat Buchanan describes the outs, and I guess that Churchill either made a blunder of not giving Hitler the outs, or was looking, for war and to kill people. I guess if you want to go more evil with it.
Yeah.
What to you makes Hitler a trustworthy partner at that time, that you could have given the outs without fear of I mean, maybe I'm being the dumbass. It's the same as when they yelled at Putin's looking to take over all of Russia right now, and I go, hey, I don't think he's looking to do so. And no matter what, you got the lens of history of, hey, Hitler's the most evil, and if the Allies hadn't taken him out, he would have taken over the world. So what at that time would kind of indicate that I guess Hitler was a trustworthy partner, that they could have struck in a peace agreement and just allowed him to take for example Poland or something else, and he would have called it a day.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're not gonna be surprised by my answer. Of course, Hitler wasn't a trustworthy partner.
Right.
But the question is that what could have what could have occurred is simply if he's going to take something like Poland and occupy it and remember, the ostensible purpose for taking and annexing Austria and other lands up to that time was because, one, there were a lot of Germans in it, okay? And then two, that Germany was the rightful owner of this property and territory. And then furthermore, that the Germans needed these resources, which they could not trust the Allies to provide through a kind of free mechanism of trade and commerce. You see? So he takes over Poland, yes, and he invades Poland. By the way, of course, we are missing a whole half of that, which Buchanan does a masterful job of reminding us of, and that it wasn't just Germany who invaded Poland. It was the Soviet Union at the same time, according to the Nazi Soviet non-aggression principle, that pact that divided Poland. And then from that point on, remember that 9-month period after September of 1939, there's this period called the Phony War. And whether you want to trust Hitler or not, what I say we, but what Churchill and Roosevelt did was simply say, okay, first of all, they had been pining for a war with Germany for a very long time. And there was rabid anti-German sentiment among the various cabinets in both Britain. And who's to be trustworthy here? Well, let's see what if Hitler's wrong? He's lying at least, and he says, I'm not going to invade Holland and I'm not going to invade Belgium, just like we did in World War I before that. And we're not even going to occupy France. But why don't you, because we find the Jews to be such a scapegoat and a burden race to our people. Remember, he had made overtures to just simply deport the Jewish population out of Germany and the occupied territories, the German occupied territories. And of course, none of the allies, in fact, they were obstinate of saying, no, we're not taking any Jews. So it blows up this myth that what I'm arguing is Hitler's not a trusted source. Of course not. He constantly backdealed and the like. But we have to look at it in just kind of realpolitik, real politics in the practical sense. What's the incentive there? In other words, were his resources already being stretched thin? And that's why, and some European historians argue this, is like he's just focused on getting those resources and building up maybe his army, perhaps for an eventual invasion of the Soviet Union, which he eventually does in June of 1941. But what concern is that of the Western powers? So in the United States,
we should have just stayed out of it and let Russia and Germany basically duke it out and become, kill each other off and just both end up weaker.
Yeah, you just have two socialist, totalitarian states that are vying for control of Eastern Europe in this rapacious type of territorial expansion. And then Hitler, in many ways, is giving the West an out, saying, I don't want to involve. I mean, if you really look at a lot of Hitler's writing, going from Mein Kampf onto his speeches and essays and the like, he has this, and this is never reported either, he has this enormous affinity for the British people. He thinks they're plucky and smart and innovative and all these things. And after all, they're Germans, really. They're Germanic peoples. They're Angles and Saxons. So they're descended from them. So, and even the French are the Franks. So, I mean, there's not this visceral hatred that he had for the Slavic Eastern European peoples, who he did consider to be a kind of workforce and slave force.
Did he hate Slavs as much as he hated Jews?
No, because, well, we can't obviously get into his maniacal heart, but I would argue that it was Jews at the top, because again, the scapegoating and blame that he laid at the feet. See, he always thought Jews were conspiring with the Western powers and financiers to ruin Germany through their banking system and the like. And then but the Slavs were right there.
All right, so let me just ask you differently.
Yeah.
All right, so let's say we just let Hitler have his way. So what happens?
Invades Poland.
He invades Poland, he kicks out all the Jews, and then he goes to war with Russia, and then Russia and Germany are basically deking it out until one takes over the other. And I guess if Russia wins, then you're in the same place that we were at the end of World War II, or Hitler wins, and then what? So if Hitler wins, you think he stops expanding, and what, does he kill off all the Russians? Does he take the territory? Does he operate, or did Hitler never plan that far ahead?
We're doing a counterfactual, kind of doing speculative history, but what I would just argue is that they would be these massive militaries, in Russia's or the Soviet Union with its enormous population would just wear each other down. It would be very much like we would have seen probably something along the lines of the Eastern Front in World War II, the devastation that was wrought in the Western Front during World War I.
Right.
And remember, what was the outcome of World War I? I mean, you have France is devastated. 1/3 of every fighting Frenchman was dead.
How did Germany rally so much between World War I and World War II that they had a total stalemate with France in World War I, and then in World War II, I guess they just kicked their ass?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is, as military historians will tell you, was the speed. by which also the French famously allocated a lot of resources along this what's called the Maginot Line along the border with Germany in Alsace and Lorraine, and so it was weird because they built bunkers with like movie theaters underneath them and all these defensive ramparts.
So they did stupid French shit. All right, let me ask you a different question. All right, so Churchill mistakenly doesn't stay out of the war, and so he goes to war with Germany, and eventually that leads to Russia becoming the evil superpower that it is. So I think let's chalk that up to stupidity. Those were bad blunders or bad bets. All right. So what is it that makes Churchill evil then? What like in other words, he might have just messed up and he thought Hitler was more of a threat than he actually was. It's not like he was Hitler where he was like, all right, we're going to round up and kill all the Jews or whatever else, horrible things Hitler did. But I think that's probably number one on the list is going genocidal and, just allocating resources into exterminating Jews.
Right.
So what is it that makes Churchill not just dumb, but actually evil?
Okay. First of all, let's do it from the perspective of a variety of peoples involved in World War II or World War I, for that matter. So from the German perspective, what makes Churchill evil? And I'm not talking about the Nazi perspective, just the German perspective overall. World War I, in that period of time, Churchill was the Vice Lord of the Admiralty, which basically meant that, or he was Lord of the Admiralty. He was in charge of the British Navy. If you know anything about military history, you know the British Navy was supreme for centuries. And on top of that, it was the main means by which Britain had and policed an enormous empire, and it was the strength of its military. So what does he deploy the British Navy to do in World War I? Well, he creates a hunger blockade in the North Sea, right? By the way, this is against every norm of international law pertaining to warfare. You're not supposed to starve out a civilian population through blockade. We know this well vis-a-vis the Israeli occupation of Gaza. This is exactly what they're doing. It's against every convention pertaining to warfare or just war. So Churchill, by the way, this is an arbitrary hunger blockade. So he put mines in the North Sea. Now, what's the problem with a mine? Well, a mine can't differentiate between whether this is a grain ship or this is a German U-boat or warship, right? So you mine the North Sea, and then get this. So the German population during World War I, particularly at the end, is literally starving. I mean, the horrific stories about cannibalism and the like, we're never told because it's Germany and they're supposed to get what they deserve, but we're always told this about the Holodomor and other, like in the Ukraine or other periods of time. But they're supposed to get this. And I'm not just saying this because I'm German or my ancestry is German. So anyway, he holds on this hunger blockade. After the war is clearly over, this is after the major offensive in World War I, the Michael offensive, that is pushed back by the Allies in the Ardennes forest, yet again in the same area where the Battle of the Bulge is going to be taking place later in World War II. He kept the thing on. I mean, the war is, for all intents and purposes, over. He kept the thing on for like another 9 months. Germans depended upon grain imports for sustenance. And so there's figures of this to match, so sociological figures that matches rampant disease, starvation, hypothermia, all these terrible like malnutrition diseases all of a sudden crop up. Children are dying in wild disproportions. I mean, it's a true war crime. Kept it on for no reason. Let's look at the. By the way, what's his first move as he's the war leader and prime minister of Britain after Chamberlain steps down or is actually ousted? He tries to put another hunger blockade on Germany, but the problem is Hitler and the Nazis knew that Churchill wasn't very creative, so they already had U-boat supremacy to stop the British Navy from putting in that hunger blockade. Let's look at the American. Well, okay, let's continue with the German perspective. As Daryl Cooper pointed out in his Tucker Carlson talk, and I wonder if he's going to talk about this with Dave, or he did talk about it with Dave. But at the beginning of the war, right, we're told that, remember, it was Hitler who just arbitrarily, first of all, he always was pining to take over Britain. And then he has the Luftwaffe just because he's a maniacal sadist, bomb civilian populations in York and Birmingham and London, right? And we have all these famous stories about Londoners going down into the tube, the subway system.
Okay.
Well, what does Churchill do? Well, Churchill, but Hitler's, by the way, signaling to Churchill, or he's writing messages with the British Foreign Ministry and Churchill himself saying, before I don't even want to go into war with you. But the reason for, as it turns out, and Daryl Cooper points this out too, he says, look, the reason that the Germans started bombing the civilian centers in Britain, it was only after, it was post hoc. The Churchill was just at a loss. He couldn't do anything to affect the rolling tide in the early part of the war. We're talking about late 40, early 41. And the Nazis are just storming into Holland and Britain, or I'm sorry, in Belgium and France. And France falls in 1940 in June of that year. And so he's got nothing to do. So he's just bombing these German civilian populations because he can't get over to any of the cities, and he can't go to any of the German military establishments because the Luftwaffe is so supreme. So the Royal Air Force is just killing random Germans in non-combatant areas. And so that's what Hitler says. He kind of relents and he says, well, I have to stop. I have to start bombing the English people and the British people. So that's the German perspective. Right. Can I say the American perspective real quick?
Sure.
Churchill owns a very ignominious distinction. It's actually one that's only shared in my mind with George Washington. And that is, he started 2 world wars and drew America into them. Especially with Churchill, they were totally unnecessary. One could argue that the French and Indian War and the American Revolutionary War were obviously essential to the United States and the American colonies at the time, but totally unrelated to the United States and any kind of interest that would be deemed as genuinely American. Churchill pulls the United States into World War I. He openly supported the stupid policy that Wilson's administration followed, to the extent that William Jennings Bryan, who was the Secretary of War under Wilson, had actually quit and resigned. He said, all these policies are just dragging us into a war, and I can't be on this. And then, of course, Wilson appoints Robert Lansing, and he's like sort of total Anglophile, and he does this. So Churchill's urging all these passenger ships to go into a war zone, and he was also negotiating openly with the Americans to get munitions on board these passenger ships. I mean, we know for a fact the Lusitania, the famous Lusitania that sunk in May of 1915, was laden with armaments. It sunk within like 14 minutes. And in fact, this was later proven, I think it was in 2006, I chronicle this in the book, an expeditionary diving team from England told the British government they're going to go and search the hull of the Lusitania. And immediately the British government ordered a cease and desist order to the divers saying, no, there's live munitions on there. They're still active.
So to make the case for Churchill, let's go dumb and evil. Mm-hmm. It's that he did not need to get involved in World War II. Hitler had no beef with him. Taking on the beef with Hitler resulted in Hitler going genocidal, and then Russia actually, coming to dominate all of Europe, and ceding, Eastern, leaving Stalin around to then go starve his own people. Mm-hmm. And on top of all of that, it's not like he just made the blunders. He actually was the first in the war to start targeting civilians.
Yes. I mean, one could argue that the first ones to target civilians were actually in the other theater, the Pacific theater, where the Japanese are doing ethnic cleansing in Manchuria in China. And that was obviously a targeting of civilians. But really, the initiator of the targeting of civilians out of desperation to do something to roll back the tide.
On the Japan front, is it kind of the same thing of, couldn't we just leave Japan and China to duke it out?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, talk about an unnecessary war, although Buchanan doesn't focus on this in his book, the Japanese theater, the Pacific theater, was totally unwarranted. I mean, it should be noted that, of course, I don't know if we talked about this before, but I only found this out fairly recently, like within the year. In 1933, so when FDR takes the helm as president, and he gets his cabinet together for their first meeting, you know what the first question he asked then Secretary of War Henry Stinson, or he was Secretary of State or Secretary of War, I can't remember. When are we going to war with Japan? This is in 1933.
And why did he want to go to war with Japan so bad? Why was that exciting to him?
not unlike his somewhat distant relative Theodore Roosevelt, for FDR, Japan was the major imperial rival to American supremacy in the Pacific. And as a result, to mitigate and roll back Japanese claims would allow for the United States to have an open commercial and imperial hand in East Asia. And the Japanese weren't having none of it. I mean, people don't even understand because they never heard the history. I mean, talk about blockades. In the years, the months prior to the war, not only were we funding the Chinese nationalists, and Britain was too, in fighting the Japanese in their war of conquest in China, but we cut off this resource depleted series of islands, this archipelago nation of Japan. We arbitrarily, and by the way, without congressional approval, it was just an arbitrary act dictatorial act by the Roosevelt administration. We stopped or blockaded the island of oil imports, any oil imports into Japan from the Dutch East Indies, which was their major oil source.
All right,
And
let me.
go ahead.
No, okay, aim through a completely amoral lens. All right, so we're shelving our morality, and we're thinking here like elites. So Churchill fucks up because he could have let Russia duke it out with Germany, and then they could have basically have just weakened the other powers. Okay. From a United States standpoint, and once again, this is an amoral lens, the fact that we walked away from World War II as the world reserve currency and then was basically able to inflate away the world's wealth and borrow for the next 100 years.
That's it.
And maybe we're running into problems now because I guess maybe, China's more powerful and other people have nuclear bombs as well. And, there's the tensions that we could always escalate towards, blowing up the whole world or the Chinese Communist Party dictating our lives. But let's just imagine that we didn't blow our lead over the last 40 years after coming off we walked away as the world reserve and we had a nice ability to grift and steal money. Was it a good gamble for the U.S.? Purely
Not necessarily, because okay. I think of what, and there are some mainstream historians that'll even admit this. Famously, David Kennedy and Elizabeth Cohen wrote a very well-renowned and regarded, although I don't think it should be, textbook that's used across the United States called the American Pageant Series. And David Kennedy, I think he was at Princeton for a while or Stanford or whatever. Both of them write that, and this is a paraphrase, but I'll do my best to quote it directly. He said, "The war did more than even the New Deal as a response to the Great Depression to instantiate and to ensconce the permanent emergency state, welfare warfare state over the United States."
Got it.
So, of course, who gains from this? I mean, I always think of, Irving Kristol's line about 2 cheers for capitalism, right? And the justification for all this. Well, we need these rather socialistic seeming on their face. William F. Buckley saying, well, we need totalitarianism in the United States to beat totalitarianism abroad. This is no different than Lincoln saying we're going to suspend the Constitution in order to save it. I mean, there's just an irrationality that defies imagination here. It's horrific in the sense that and people have to wake up to this. And that's why, the book, The Swiss History of the United States, ends in 1945. My argument is, along with Garrett and other kind of free market and libertarian and ANCAP thinkers, is like the whole idea of a people being sovereign over the government and its actual execution in response to the domestic concerns of that population is absolutely wiped out. It's vitiated. It's totally destroyed by World War II and think about the rhetoric from that point on. No longer is it like, we don't hear debates like between, I don't know, James G. Blaine and Grover Cleveland about, well, how we're going to lower tariff policy to benefit the economic arrangement in the United States, or what can we do to ward off other imperial powers from interfering in our affairs. Instead, it's what I'm going to do for you, what country we're going to take over, and how are we going to spread the American ideal of democracy, because we're supposed to be the city on the hill, and we're taking over from Britain after World War II, and we're going to be the main lead in the Anglosphere to force our way of life upon other people, no matter how drastically different their cultures, populations, economies might be. It's just the elaborate justification for the warfare welfare state, the military industrial complex. And ever since then, it's like, have we in any way, in our rhetoric, in our policies, foreign and domestic, do we even have the hint of going back to like the old America of normalcy, just kind of like the splendid isolationism of Washington or anything like that? No, it's always this new emergency, this new enemy. When the Soviet Union falls in December of 1991, all of a sudden we have Iraq invading Kuwait, and we have to go off into these adventurous wars in the Middle East.
Okay, one last question, and then we're going to change gears to another topic. We'll do about another 15 minutes. Let's say no one had gotten involved in World War II, and we left Germany just to go fight Russia. If you hadn't had like the brain drain out of Germany, an operation, I think paperclip or otherwise, is there a possibility that they would have beaten us to the nuclear bomb, and then we actually would have had, the Dr. Evil version of Hitler, where, he would actually like basically go, all right, I'm running everything or I'm bombing everybody? Is that a possibility or too cartoonish?
I think it's cartoonish. Cartoonish in a number of ways. Have you read this stuff that there's some contention, and I'm finding it a little bit more and more convincing the more I dive into the sources, that nuclear weapons are a myth?
I have only heard this. I've seen this chatter on Twitter. It's nothing I've ever delved into.
Now I just went and invalidated all of my salient points that I made for the audience before, right?
Do you think they're still a myth, or just at that time it was a myth?
I think, almost certainly at the time. I'm more and more convinced that Nagasaki and Hiroshima were not nuclear weapons.
We just firebombed them and said we had a super weapon?
Precisely.
And why I mean, if we had already firebombed place, why was it worse or seemingly like, because I thought the firebombing actually killed more people and was worse.
It did. And the payloads that were launched over Tokyo were actually larger in terms of their destructive path than
okay, but does that negate your other theory that Roosevelt flew the nuclear warheads and designs over to Stalin over the North Pole?
Well, that's not my theory. That's McMeekin talking about in Stalin's war. It was just that they were the Soviet spies and agents had total immunity, carte blanche to go and freedom to go into any of the war-making facilities, McDonnell Douglas, Boeing, you name it, during the war. And they were, and we have records of the executives at people, even the workers at these plants.
Being like, why are we giving this to them?
What's that?
Just being like, why are we giving these designs to them?
Well, yeah. Why are there Russian agents walking around here? And they were Robbie, they were literally taking the blueprints for some of the war material and just taking them out and bringing copies of it with them. So, and then, of course, the famous one was in February of 1944. The one I had mentioned with you on that episode, and then I think you mentioned on part of the problem with Dave was like, we actually shipped enriched uranium as part of the Lend-Lease program to the Soviet Union. And so from McMeekin's perspective, he's like, yeah, that really pushed up the Soviet acquisition of a nuclear weapon. But anyway,
in your theory, does nuclear power not even exist?
No, nuclear power exists, I would argue.
And there's no way to weaponize it, though?
Or it could be weaponized, but maybe not on that magnitude.
Okay. All right, let's move on to the next topic. Before we do, I'm going to take an opportunity to plug Porch Tour. There's actually a Chicago one. Hit me up. I will get you the address. You're invited. I hope to see you there. No ticket needed. But porchtour.com, I extended 10 cities, and I'm going to be filming a first ever comedy special in Denver. So if you're out there or you want to make the trip out to Denver, it's going to be a good time. And Gary, why don't you let them know about your podcast and your book?
Yeah. So I'm the host of the Hot Water History podcast, where myself and a former student, I was a history professor at a couple of institutions up until 2020 for a variety of reasons. I got canned from those positions. You can read about that on the website, which is hotwaterhistory.com. You can find my scholarly work there, essays, and then, of course, my podcast I host with a former student of mine. And Robbie's promised to come on. So
I'll do it.
when he's done porching or something like that. Hey, maybe we could do something together at the Chicago event. Those are
We
my people anyway.
we shall. It's a possibility. Let's all right. Let's change gears here and cover
Mhm.
one last topic, which
Okay.
is I have a joke at the moment that's this one it needs a better ending, but the core of it's working, and I mean I don't want to give away the joke, but basically what I'm playing around with in my head, and this is tragic but funny to me. The idea that we have Ukraine and Russia are mortal enemies, and I have to dig in more on the specifics of this, and I covered it on Run Your Mouth, but somehow they can get along for oil profits, and that even though there's a war going on, Russia is still paying Ukraine to transport its oil through Ukraine. And so, in some capacity, they're able to get along. You know,
Mhm.
I guess they can fight a war when it comes over land and civilians dying, but when it comes to their oil profits, they're both like, yeah, we don't want any part of that action.
Yeah.
And there's something and I'm working off of Rothbard's Anatomy of a State, where he talks about the way that countries go to war and they wrap us into it. And there's interesting scenes. Band of Brothers, even if you think World War II was a disaster, it might be one of the greatest television shows outside of Breaking Bad, and they're in different
Mhm.
categories. But there's an interesting element there where you see the German soldiers interacting with the American soldiers, and you can kind of get a feeling of like they're both people serving their country on both sides.
Mhm.
And there's this thing about the elites that they seem to be able to insulate themselves from the consequences of war, where it seems like if we were to make them put up their assets, their money, their mansions, their homes, their bunkers, we probably, like, in other words, the reason why these wars seem to go on is because it doesn't affect them. The things that actually seem to me would end wars is if the elites actually had to duke it out or had something or had some stakes in the game. It's
Yeah.
it's always us. It's sanctions. They don't really harm the elites. They harm the civilians. It's like they seem to constantly create these positions where they pretend like I'm at war with Russia, and then it's not that the elites are in some sort of a skirmish over assets, and then they seem to almost protect themselves from, I bet Putin's still living a pretty nice life. It
Of
might
course.
not be as much fun as when he can tour the world, but
Yeah.
I bet his mansion's still pretty great, and I bet
Yeah.
his life doesn't look that much different.
Think about all these connected people in Ukraine. There's a huge population of Ukrainians who are living large in Cyprus. They're living in mansions and resorts. They're doing nothing. They're just out there because they're the protected class. I think this is a lot about. You ever hear the concept of revelation of the method?
Okay,
So,
I've not.
okay, so there's this idea among people who are convinced that a lot of demonic activities going on within the world, and has for a long, long time, but that when there's a kind of spiritual takeover and the elites are dabbling in the things we talked about at the beginning, pedophile cults, satanic ritual, Bohemian Grove, all the stuff that we've spoken of in the past, that in order to further not just insulate themselves, as you said, and protect themselves from all of this slaughter going on within the world, but they actually gain advantage from this. And like I said, the Ukrainian oligarchs and Zelensky's personal worth has gone through the roof, and they're living high on the hog. While, of course, the hogs, you and I, the useless feeders or eaters, are out there fighting in, Ukraine's now. What is the draft age now? Or is like 47? The average age of the Ukrainian army is 46 or something like that. It's insane. So what they do is they kind of they revel in the elites letting out some of the things that they're about to do or how they do it. And then those who kind of dig into, maybe we would dub them conspiracy theorists, and you could call me that if you like, but then they also manipulate the media to say, oh, look at how insane these actions are, or how these people think all of this is insane. Like Pizzagate could never have occurred. That's absurd. And then sure enough, we know years later that there's a lot of substantial evidence behind all of these things. So that's what's called revelation method. Now, I think in many ways that's how the world has worked in a long time. It's just that when you have the integration of enormous technology, and I mean, think about the ways in which we talk about those totalitarian regimes that existed under Stalin and Hitler and fascist Italy and Mussolini and Tojo in Japan, but combine them with the surveillance techniques and technologies and mass communication, control of social media companies, and then you have real totalitarianism that they can also kind of shroud in oh, we're just doing this for your good. We are doing this to protect you from a deadly virus. We're doing this to protect you from an evil enemy, Putin and Putler, and as they call him, that's, I think, what's going on.
So what's like, maybe we can close it out with this. But what could we, I guess, as citizens, demand as a better structure? Because I would say, all right, fine, you're Biden, you're going to become president. You got to put up your entire net worth if you get us into another war. But then people would go, well, if he does that, then even if there's a tragic war that we're going to lose, he might not want to go fight it because he's going to walk away poor. And we need our world leaders to actually be empowered to go fight evil. So then you might go, all right, well, then this game plan that every country, their world leaders, every country should demand from their world leaders that they go and do that. Well, then what am I describing? That there's going to be one government authority that enforces if you become the head of Russia, you're putting up all your assets, you're becoming the head of this, you're putting up all your assets. And then you run into, well, then are you just basically ceding the earth to whoever's the most evil and ruthless who will not participate in that system? And then does that then supersede that? Like if let's say America, France, Russia, Germany, China all agree to that system. If you're the world leader, you got to put up all your money, and then someone opts out of that. So then what? Then they all get a pass, and then you end up at the same place. So I'm just wondering, because there's just something about the fact that, like, I mean, I said it with the Iran thing, that it seemed to me like Iran struck back at Israel in a way that wouldn't escalate. And I'm like, well, you guys somehow got along on this one. Or
Sure.
even with Russia, up until this war, basically, we were working together on the space station. It's like when there's incentives to get along, we seem to get along. And then even when we're fighting, as far as the elites are concerned, you guys seem to figure out how to keep your profits in play without any ramifications for these wars. So, like, I guess what I'm trying to game theory here is, like, how do we create mechanisms so that it's like the elites actually have more skin in the game, so that, they're not always just hiding behind, hey, the pawns that they don't care about.
Yeah. The elite power over the global system is all as a result of their insatiable, what St. Augustine called libido dominandi. It's not so much that they love the money and the riches and the wealth and affluence are secondary. What they really relish and lust after is just the ability to dominate all of us. So the only, from my perspective, only viable answer or solution to that is I'm a good Hoppian. It's 10,000 Liechtensteins. Create in a subsidiarity way, independent and micro political organizations that can truly be sovereign representatives of a truly sovereign people. Unless we could divorce the mega state from its mechanisms and capacities, there's never going to be kind of any type of lasting peace. Just draw this into the debate last night. I mean, when you guys were talking about on the post-debate episode, it's like, yeah, you were so spot on about how Trump totally botched the whole DEI thing with Kamala, like how to identify her.
Well, he looks so weak, because it's like you got to step up and be strong and actually, like, he just walks away from policy. And in that one, you're being bitched out. The whole reason why, for example, people like me might support Donald Trump is to go, listen, I don't like the censorship, but at least this guy's the fuck you to that system.
Yes.
And so when we live in a world of DEI hires and her claiming to be something she's not, lying to the people who are interested in that system, and then turning around and going, well, why do you care about identity? I don't. You're the one that cares about it.
It's the whole identity of it's the modus operandi of the Democratic Party. It's the whole thing.
Right. And so for him just to go, I don't want to step on this third rail, I might come off as offensive. It's like, buddy, that's your whole thing, is that you're supposed to be our champion of this is stupid.
But go back to, like, the political system. I mean, remember what his answer was with the whole abortion thing? He's like, it was genius. Everybody, Democratic, Republican, wanted to be brought back to the states. So he's arguing for federalism. But then when he goes back, I mean, he has a total easy out for COVID. What was the good thing he did during COVID? He even has mentioned this in the past. He's like, I turned it to the states for their local solutions, right? All you have to do is say, look, my answer for abortion and the remedy to this national problem he's right, just tore us apart, is to bring it back to the states. And hopefully, and he could just come out and say, I think abortion is horrific. Why don't we create an economic of such a strong economic country where women aren't thinking the first choice is to abort their child. Right. I mean, and I'm going to do that with the greatest economy ever. So he could go on that. And then like healthcare, he had complained that Kamala's plan was non-existent, like bird fetch dog, dog fetch bird, or whatever he was saying. And then he goes in the later debate. He's like, bless you. I don't have a plan.
Yeah, that was his worst moment of the whole debate.
That was horrible. Just, and all he said, like you guys said on the episode, is just bring it down to the states. I'm going to sound like beating a drum over and over again, but the more you can, again, localize and federalize this power instead of centralize and nationalize it, that's the key. At least that's the start. Otherwise, really, I mean, our cultures, our ways of life, I mean, on a microcosmic and then macrocosmic basis are all pretty fucked up. So
there you go.
Until we change that culture, we can.
I got to pee again, and I got to pack for this flight. Gary, always a pleasure. Thanks for coming on. I will. These episodes will be out shortly. I mean, it's live right now, so it's on YouTube and Twitter. And why don't you plug the podcast one more time?
Sure. OKC and Tulsa is it for a treat this weekend with you and Dave going there. Plug the podcast again at hotwaterhistory.com. Come see me on the website. Interact. We could do that. My book is A Twisted History of the United States. You could buy it through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, stuff like that. I'm working on another book that's trying to try to bring theories of Catholicism and see if they mesh with anarcho-capitalism. So that'll be out in a couple of years.
Oh, that rolls. Rolls. I like that. A couple of years. That means you're really doing your work.
It takes a long time to write for your books. I'm sorry.
I respect it. All right. Have a great night. Thank you, Mr. Gary.
All right, Robbie. You're the best. Thank you.